It's time for May birthday shoutouts. May is one of my favorite months of the year. As we were talking about over on Patreon, it's when the school year here in the U.S. is wrapping up. We get a little bit more of that flexibility and freedom that I love having to go on trips and do exciting things. The sun is out, the flowers are in bloom, gardens are started. May is just such a great month, and I want to send some very happy birthdays to our May babies from Patreon. So a very happy birthday to Mary, Carmel, Aria, Carly, Helen, Melissa, Kate, Ellie, Allison, Katie, Emily Rose, and Leah. Happy birthday. Have a great birthday month. I want to thank you for your support over on Patreon and hope you have a very, very happy birthday. From the outside, Richard and Phyllis Nelson had the perfect marriage, and even those on the inside, like their daughters, saw it that way until their father's personality seemed to change. Phyllis saw his anger as a byproduct of work stress, but she soon found out that wasn't all. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome back to Crime Lines. Welcome for the first time if you are new. Just a quick reminder that I am going to CrimeCon UK, and it's in about 3.5-4 weeks. There are so many interesting panels happening, and you will get to meet me at the Creator Gallery. One thing I like is that they have set times that everyone is supposed to be at their tables, so you don't have to keep popping in to try to meet everyone you want. I'll probably be at my table most of the time, to be honest, so you'll be able to find me easily enough. And if you use code CrimeLines, you will save some money on your ticket. Also, if you are going, shoot me an email so I know to look for you. Like I've told those who have recently donated to my coffee fund, I'm saving it all up, and those funds will fuel me through the entire trip. I've been fortunate to expand the trip to London out a few days on either side so that I can really sightsee as I'm also trying to fight off jet lag. Let's go ahead and get into today's case, and the main sources are the Des Moines Register and the Iowa City Press Citizen, and yes, that means this is another Iowa case. We are going to start with Richard and Phyllis Nelson. They both grew up in the Lutheran church and met at church camp when they were in high school. They were pretty inseparable after that, and when they finished high school, they went to Rock Island, Illinois, so they could attend college together. After finishing their undergraduate degrees, they married in 1969, and Richard went to medical school at Northwestern University in Chicago. Phyllis got a job as an elementary school teacher to help pay the bills. Richard then did a fellowship focusing on developmental pediatrics at Harvard. In 1978, Richard got a job in Minnesota where he was working as a developmental pediatrician. He eventually became the director of the Developmental Disabilities Program at Gillette Children's Hospital in St. Paul. Phyllis was busy raising their two daughters and supporting Richard's career by holding down the fort in every way at home. The family moved again in 1987 when Richard took a position at the University of Iowa as a faculty member, and then later as the director of the Child Health Specialty Clinics program. They settled in at their new home in Iowa City. The reason I am pointing out all these moves and job positions is to show that Richard Nelson was finding success everywhere he went. Northwestern to Harvard to Gillette, and then as a program director at the University of Iowa. And his success would continue in Iowa. Richard's focus was on special needs children and specifically the gap in care for those without health insurance and those without the means to pay for additional therapies and early intervention. He was so highly and widely respected in his field that he was promoted to the position of executive dean at the University of Iowa's College of Medicine. Richard took this job in 1994, and if his family thought he worked long hours before this, it was nothing like what it was after being appointed to this new position. But Richard remained active at the family's home church, and he and Phyllis were always at the high school while their daughters were active in the music and theater programs. Phyllis worked as a substitute teacher, which allowed her to pick and choose her hours as they fit into the family's schedule. It was really something that kept her in the educational field, which is somewhere she excelled. And when their daughters were out of school and off to college, Phyllis started volunteering more. Richard and Phyllis Nelson had built this life together for around 30 years when in the late 1990s, things started to change. Richard had taken on a huge project at work. He was overseeing the construction of a new $125 million medical education research facility, which was the university's largest capital project to date. So when Richard started becoming more irritable and distant at home, Phyllis chalked it up to work stress. At the time, Phyllis had plenty to focus on while Richard was working longer hours. Their younger daughter was preparing to get married in August of 2000, and their older daughter was pregnant with their first grandchild. But Richard continued to withdraw throughout 2000, and Phyllis's worry that this was just work stress turned into concern that this was depression, especially in 2001. Old friends noticed it too. They saw Richard pull away from them as well, not keeping in touch as much and being quiet when they did get together. But the most alarming change, according to Phyllis and their daughters, was Richard's anger. He never had more of a temper than anyone else, but that had slowly changed. And it wasn't just during arguments that he would snap at Phyllis. For example, one time on Easter 2001, she just asked him to go pick some daffodils for the table, and according to Phyllis, he cursed at her, calling her a name. A few weeks after that Easter incident, Richard told Phyllis that he just needed some space. He assured her that it wasn't about the marriage, but rather something he had to do for himself. He went 30 minutes away to Amana and stayed for a couple of weeks. In May 2001, Richard came back home to Iowa City, and he and Phyllis began seeing a marriage counselor. One night in late May, Richard said he was going for a walk and left the house. It was getting late. He didn't normally go for these evening walks, and Phyllis sat at home thinking about how depressed he had been. Worried, she went looking for him. She ended up seeing Richard before he saw her. Richard later characterized it as Phyllis hiding behind a tree, but she found him about a block or so from the house at the Iowa River. He was on his cell phone talking to a woman named Mary Jo, and he was expressing to her how much he missed her. Now, Phyllis knew Mary Jo. She had been Richard's secretary for years, but had recently taken a position in a different department. They had worked on that big building project together until she left, and with Richard's work stress, Phyllis understood why he would miss Mary Jo in a professional capacity. So after Phyllis and Richard were back home, Phyllis called Mary Jo and expressed that she was concerned about how Richard was doing. Mary Jo said she was worried as well, primarily about Richard's mental health. And then, during the conversation that followed, Mary Jo confessed to Phyllis that she had fallen in love with Richard. Phyllis was shocked, and she told Mary Jo that their 30-year marriage deserved some respect. Phyllis got off the phone, uncomfortable with what Mary Jo had said, but also thinking it was ridiculous. Things at home didn't get better after this, and in July 2001, so about 2 months after this phone call, Richard told Phyllis he needed space again, and not just for a short stay away. He rented an apartment 30 minutes north in Cedar Rapids. Because Richard characterized this as him needing space and not a separation, Phyllis supported this, and she and Richard still saw each other. They attended church together, and they would go out. Richard came and went from the house in Iowa City, and Phyllis even occasionally went to his apartment. One day in late July, when Phyllis went to the apartment, unannounced, she saw Mary Jo leaving. This raised her eyebrows, so Phyllis asked about why Mary Jo had been at the apartment. And Richard said they were just talking. They were friends after all. He wasn't, in his words, some neighborhood Lothario. It appeared that Phyllis accepted this explanation, but it's clear she wasn't entirely convinced, because a few weeks later, Phyllis and Richard were out for the night, and when they got home, Richard said he needed to head into the office to finish something up. After he left, Phyllis wondered if Richard was telling the truth. She decided to look up Mary Jo's address and drive by just to see if Richard's car was out front, which it was. Before Phyllis could leave, Richard came out of the building and spotted her. According to Phyllis, he asked what she was doing there, and then he cursed at her, which upset her. But Richard again denied that anything was going on with him and Mary Jo. And I know there is a cliche about the powerful man and the affair with his hot young secretary. And maybe if that's what was happening here, Phyllis would have been more suspicious. But Mary Jo was roughly their age. She was just a few years younger than them. They're all in their late 40s, early 50s at this point. And as reporters later noted, Mary Jo and Phyllis weren't physically dissimilar. Affairs can be more complicated and occasionally more nuanced than physical appearance and attraction, which, based on the reporting I saw that was taking place at the time, this was news to quite a few people. But that's not the main reason Phyllis didn't realize at this point what the rest of us have already realized, and that was that her husband was definitely having an affair. It's that a few years before this, Richard started experiencing issues with impotency. Or at least that's what he told Phyllis. He told her that he went to the doctor and was diagnosed with low testosterone. He said that going forward, their sex life might be limited, which Phyllis understood and accepted. So assuming her husband was impotent, it seemed unlikely to Phyllis that he was having a physical affair. In August of 2001, Richard moved back into the Iowa City home again full-time. He still had the apartment, but he didn't seem to need the space anymore. He was home and ready to get things back on track. But before he did, he had to confess something to Phyllis. And that's when he admitted that he had, in fact, been having an affair with Mary Jo. And not a short one. It started long before Phyllis would have even suspected anything. It had been going on for the previous 3 years, starting in 1998. Mary Jo and Richard had been working together for about 2 years at that point. It was September of 1998 that Richard had written Mary Jo a letter and left it on her desk. The note was about some work she had done on a project that he was very appreciative of, and he was praising her for it. Mary Jo was touched by the letter and thanked Richard for it when she saw him later that day. They then started talking, and as the conversation progressed, Richard admitted to Mary Jo that he had some, quote, difficult feelings for her. Mary Jo admitted to him that she had feelings for him as well, and in spite of them both being married at the time, they began a sexual affair within a month of this. For about 3 years, this relationship was on and off, but it was more on than off for all of 1999 and into 2000. Mary Jo and her husband divorced in this time, but not because of the affair. It was because of their overall relationship issues. And Richard started making future plans with Mary Jo. Except Richard was still married, and he had not filed for divorce. He told Mary Jo that things would change in August of 2000, the same month that Mary Jo's divorce was final. His younger daughter was getting married, and he didn't want to impact her big day by leaving Phyllis leading up to it. But once the wedding was over and his 2 daughters were officially off on their own, things would be different. And then they weren't. Richard made no moves to leave Phyllis, so in the months that followed, Mary Jo started seeing less of Richard as she realized this future together wasn't going to happen. But Mary Jo didn't entirely break things off. They continued to see each other, and when Richard rented the Cedar Falls apartment in July of 2001, he put Mary Jo down as his emergency contact on the rental paperwork. Then Richard moved back in with Phyllis in August 2001, and Mary Jo at that point broke things off. She needed to move on with her life, and she wasn't going to put things on pause any longer while Richard decided what he wanted to do. So Phyllis and Richard were back together and became sexually intimate again, but he had confessed the affair. Trust can be hard to rebuild, so when Richard started emotionally withdrawing from Phyllis again, it was a red flag that he might be seeing Mary Jo. He wasn't, but I can see why Phyllis was suspicious. So Phyllis ended up going to Richard's office in the fall of 2001 to see if there was any evidence that the affair was ongoing. She didn't find proof of that because at this point it wasn't ongoing, but she found something that probably hurt her just as much. Months previously, before Phyllis knew about the affair, Richard went to northern Minnesota for a week by himself, and that is quote-unquote by himself. But Phyllis learned, based on some photos that were found in his desk, he wasn't alone. He was with Mary Jo. This place in Minnesota wasn't just any place. It was somewhere that Richard and Phyllis had regarded as their place, a romantic getaway spot that they loved going to together. And Richard took Mary Jo there. I don't know if this was Phyllis's thinking, but she wouldn't be the first person to forgive physical cheating, but not sure she could get past the emotional intimacy. Phyllis took the photos and she brought them to a friend of hers. According to Phyllis, she was asking a dear friend for advice. But of all the dear friends Phyllis chose to go to, she opted for the friend who just so happened to be Richard's boss. And this was a big deal. The university had a strict policy against supervisors having relationships with employees. Phyllis may have said she went there for advice, but she ended up getting Richard in trouble, and I can't help but suspect she knew that would be the outcome. Not that I blame her, but I can't imagine she didn't know that this would impact his career. Mary Jo had already moved to a new department, and at the time Phyllis found the photos, they were not seeing each other any longer. So the consequence given was that Richard's bonus was cut in half, so a loss of $30,000, and an official letter of reprimand was put in his file. This was a big deal for Richard, the letter more so than the money. Richard's career had been full of wins. He was respected for his intelligence, his integrity, and his work ethic. This letter was going to follow him in his file at the university, and it would impact his reputation there. And it may have an impact on future job opportunities. Phyllis, however, was more worried about the photos and what Richard did rather than whatever consequences the university handed out. She told Richard to leave the house. This was the first time, it seems, that Phyllis spurred their separation. Every time Richard needed space, he left. This time it was Phyllis who needed the space. Richard returned to his apartment, and the next day, Phyllis left to go visit her brother in Florida. She was gone for about 3 weeks and came back on October 30th. The same night she got back to Iowa City, Richard asked both for forgiveness and to move back home. Phyllis wasn't sure she was ready, so he went back to his apartment that night. The next night, the same thing happened. He asked if he could come home and sleep at the house, and she said no. But then Phyllis was sitting home alone, thinking about it, and realized it wasn't what she wanted. She wanted a reconciliation, so why was she demanding Richard stay away? So she drove to Cedar Rapids to his apartment to talk to him. The buzzer up to his apartment didn't work, so Phyllis threw little shells at his window until she got his attention. She told him she loved him and that he could come home. This was early November 2001 at this point, and it looked like they were back together. Richard hadn't been seeing Mary Jo since August, even while Phyllis was in Florida. and it seemed like they were moving forward. But just as Richard had missed Phyllis when he wasn't with her, he missed Mary Jo when he wasn't with her. On November 26th, about 3 weeks after the most recent reconciliation with his wife, Richard decided to drive over to Mary Jo's apartment unannounced. She was in the middle of getting ready to go on a date, and Richard asked her who the other man was. She told him it wasn't any of his business, and he left. However, this re-established contact between the two of them, and their relationship was quickly rekindled. A week after showing up at Mary Jo's apartment, Richard told Phyllis he was leaving, again, and moving back into the apartment. Phyllis took this as an admission that he was seeing Mary Jo again, even though Richard tried to deny it. Around the same time he's denying his relationship with Mary Jo to Phyllis, he was proposing marriage to Mary Jo, suggesting they get married on her 50th birthday, which was just 4 months away. Mary Jo didn't say yes or no to the suggestion. She had been there with Richard before, talking about the future, only for him to go back and forth with Phyllis. Over the course of 2001, Richard had moved in and out of the family home 4 times. And that doesn't even take into account the times he was living part-time in the apartment and part-time at home. But this time, it really did look like the end. Phyllis hired a divorce attorney and had the divorce papers drawn up. By December 11th, 2001, all that was left to do was to file them. On that day, Mary Jo emailed Richard and basically said there was something non-negotiable in their relationship. And Richard would have known that meant he needed to get a divorce. Mary Jo was done with the back and forth. The same night he got that email, Richard told Mary Jo he was going to a wrestling match, but instead he went to have dinner with Phyllis. While at the house, Richard saw the divorce papers. According to Phyllis, he begged her not to file them. She essentially told him it was time to come home for good or it was time to get a divorce. It seems Mary Jo wasn't the only one done with this back and forth. Richard left the house around 7:30 after having tried to convince Phyllis not to file the papers, and Phyllis telling him she was likely going to file them in the morning. She and Richard both had the whole night to then think about it. Phyllis barely slept, trying to decide what she wanted to do. Richard, on the other hand, called Mary Jo after leaving Phyllis, and according to Mary Jo, he told her that the divorce papers had been filed, and he asked her to spend the night, which she did. As Phyllis tossed and turned, thinking about how she was ending a 33-year marriage to a man she still loved, she realized she wasn't sure she wanted to go through with it, and she felt that she and Richard had left things unresolved. So Phyllis decided to call him. The first call was shortly after midnight, and she got his voicemail. She left a message saying that she was thinking of this one time when Richard said he felt nothing for her, and she was wondering if that was true and if he had been with Mary Jo a lot during the time they were having the affair. She said she was just trying to understand everything in order to help them. 45 minutes later, Phyllis called again and left another voicemail. In this one, she said she believed that they still loved each other, and if they did, why couldn't they rebuild their life together if they showed each other mercy and tenderness? Then at 2 a.m., Phyllis called again, leaving yet another voice message. She told Richard that he was just a human being, he was flawed and sinful like everyone else, and he didn't have to be the hero. He just had to be himself. Then at 2:30, she called again and left another message. This time, Phyllis said that she wondered when he would realize that Mary Jo was using and manipulating him to get what she wanted. She said that she herself wasn't good at that sort of thing because she just puts it all out there. But maybe Richard likes being manipulated better, rather than sorting out the messy stuff. An hour and a half after that call, at 4:12 a.m., Phyllis left the last voicemail for the night. She said she thought that as Richard entered another cycle of lying, he had just so much self-hatred and self-loathing. She said she would appreciate it if he would just talk to her. It was about an hour after this last call that a neighbor of Richard's named Lois called 911. She had woken up at about 5:15 to a weird noise. She looked out the window and saw someone dressed in gray throwing something at the building. Thinking this was a weird and rather clumsy attempt at a break-in, she called the police. The police arrived at the scene, but by the time they did, this person was gone. They looked around a bit, and seeing no signs of a break-in or anything else, they got back in their patrol vehicle at 5:30 to report that they saw nothing. 3 minutes later, the same officers were dispatched back to the apartment complex due to a report of a stabbing. They tried to get into the apartment, but they couldn't because the buzzer of the apartment they were trying to get to didn't work. So they randomly hit buzzers until another tenant, who assumed it was the newspaper delivery guy who forgot his key, let them in. When the officers got into the apartment, they found Phyllis in the kitchen with Richard on the floor. She was holding a towel to his chest as the 911 dispatcher had told her to do. Phyllis said that she had stabbed Richard and the knife, which was a paring knife, was on the counter. While the paramedics stabilized Richard, who was still conscious at this point, they had Phyllis go sit in the living room and then took her to the police station. Richard was transported to the hospital, but it didn't look good. Even though it was a single stab wound with a small knife, it had hit his heart. He was awake enough when the paramedics arrived that he told them that he needed a chest tube to drain the blood from his chest. He didn't say anything about what had specifically happened. He only was concerned with the medical care he was getting. When Richard got to the hospital at 6:07, he had a heart rate of 150. It was that high to compensate for his falling blood pressure. However, his blood pressure wasn't going up, and that is a bad sign when it comes to survivability. Richard was rushed into surgery to repair the injury to the lower right chamber of his heart. He survived the surgery, however, he died at 9:41 a.m. The trauma was just too much. After Richard's death, Phyllis was arrested for murder. Initially, the judge set her bond at $250,000 cash. She spent 12 days locked up before the judge lowered it and allowed her to post 10%. But it was in those 12 days that Richard's funeral was held with 400 mourners, and sitting in lockup meant Phyllis was not among them. But she made bail and was home in time for Christmas, which her two daughters welcomed. They were supporting their mother and believed her version of events. We, the public, wouldn't hear Phyllis's full story until this went to trial, though her attorney did tease some of it out in the press. So let's go ahead and go over what Phyllis said happened. First, she said she did not go to the apartment to hurt Richard. She went over there to talk to him and to check on him. She said he was upset that she was planning to divorce him and then he wouldn't answer his phone, so she was worried. When Phyllis pulled into the parking lot, she saw Mary Jo's car. According to Phyllis, she was more relieved than upset to see the car. Because if Mary Jo and Phyllis were face-to-face with Richard to talk, maybe they would finally get to the truth of what Richard wanted, because he couldn't flip-flop in front of both of them. Phyllis also said she wasn't angry because she knew Richard had been tormented with guilt, and that's why he was angry all the time. It wasn't like he was coldly cheating on her and didn't care. Phyllis then took her shoe off to throw it at the window so that Richard would let her in. Her shoe ended up landing on the roof, so she took off her other shoe and threw that one. That's about the time Lois called 911 to report this possible break-in. But before the police arrived, Richard had come to the window and told Phyllis he'd let her in. So when Phyllis got up there, shoe in hand, she started going through the apartment to find Mary Jo. Richard said she wasn't there, and Phyllis said she had seen her car, so she knew she was there. That's when Richard said she had left already. The truth was, when Richard and Mary Jo woke up to Phyllis's shoe banging against the window, Mary Jo hid in the building's laundry room until Phyllis got up to the apartment, and then she slipped out, got in her car, and left. Even without Mary Jo there, Phyllis was hoping to talk to Richard and figure out what was going on, where were they going from here, and to resolve this issue once and for all on whether she was going to file divorce papers or not. Phyllis asked Richard if he didn't think that she had a right to know if he was planning a future with Mary Jo. Richard's response was to say that he and Mary Jo hadn't slept together that night. And that's when Phyllis got annoyed. She told him that this wasn't about where he, quote, put his penis, but about their future. She had her one shoe in her hand and she threw it at him. Phyllis said it was then that Richard exploded on her, cursing at her and yelling that he had no future because she had ruined it and ruined his career. And this is clearly referencing her disclosing his affair to his boss. In a couple of previous arguments, according to Phyllis, Richard had put his hands on her. He had pushed her, and one time he grabbed her shoulders and shook her. He was a lot bigger than her, 7 inches taller and over 100 pounds heavier. She said she believed he was going to hurt her if she did not get out of the apartment. So Phyllis tried to get to the door, but Richard blocked her way. She backed up into the kitchen where she saw the paring knife on the counter and picked it up. She figured if she had a weapon, Richard would back off and let her leave. Wanting to be sure that Richard saw the knife, Phyllis held it straight out in front of her as she left the kitchen and headed toward the front door. But there was a blind corner between the kitchen and the living room, and as she moved towards the door, Richard stepped forward, coming around that corner. He didn't see the knife in time, so when he stepped towards Phyllis, he walked right into it. Richard then stepped backwards, and Phyllis, not entirely processing what had happened, headed to the door to escape. Richard called out to her that he needed help. That's when Phyllis turned and saw the blood just all over his shirt. He said he had been stabbed in the heart, and that's when Phyllis called 911 at 5:33 a.m. There was a weird quirk with the system at the time where cell phone calls didn't always go to the 911 dispatcher, but rather to the non-emergency line. And that's what happened here. So they had Phyllis hang up and call back so that they could get it to 911 for the sake of dispatch. So the newspapers first reported that Phyllis stabbed her husband and then called the non-emergency number, which made it seem like she didn't really care to get him help. But that's not what happened, and thankfully that issue with the system was then fixed. What we just went over was the full story that came out at trial, but that's not exactly what Phyllis told the police that day. On the second 911 call, after officers arrived, Phyllis was recorded saying, "I'm responsible." The officer at the scene said, "You stabbed him?" And she said, "I did. He was with his lover." The "it was an accident" story didn't come out until later that day back at the police station. Richard, for his part, didn't say anything about Phyllis one way or the other. The only thing he said, like I mentioned, was regarding his medical care. Phyllis was charged with first-degree murder, with the state accusing her of premeditation. Initially, it was reported that the knife may have come from her house, meaning she brought it with her. The police reportedly found a can opener with a similar handle at her house, but nothing matching that knife at Richard's apartment. But Phyllis's attorney managed to find a receipt proving that Richard had bought the knife in July 2001 when he moved into the apartment. So the theory at trial to support the first-degree murder charge was that the death occurred during a forcible felony, and that felony was assault. This way, they wouldn't have to prove that Phyllis intended on killing Richard. But a forcible felony under Iowa law requires that a dangerous weapon be used. The defense argued that the paring knife was not a dangerous weapon. The knife was so small with such a short blade that a reasonable person wouldn't expect or anticipate that you could kill someone with it. The court, however, disagreed, with the judge pointing to the most logical argument. The end result of Richard's death proved that the knife was, in fact, a dangerous weapon. So the first-degree murder charge stood. The trial began in December of 2002, a year after Richard's death. Phyllis opted for a bench trial, waiving her right to a jury. Her attorney said they made the decision only after polling the community about their exposure to the case and their opinions on it. Due to the pretty constant front-page coverage, most people had heard of the case, and a disconcerting number believed that Phyllis had confessed. Her attorney worried about finding an unbiased jury that could put aside their preconceived notions and listen just to the evidence in front of them. So they opted to go with a judge-only trial. The state told the judge that Phyllis did not go to the apartment just to talk to Richard that morning and to make sure he was okay. She went there because she was angry. They argued that Phyllis had drawn up the divorce papers and left them out so that Richard would see them. They were an ultimatum, a scare tactic, so Richard would know she was serious. But instead of begging her not to file them like Phyllis claimed, the state argued that the ultimatum failed, as evidenced by Richard leaving and immediately calling Mary Jo to tell her that the marriage was over. That was why Phyllis couldn't sleep, and that was why she kept calling Richard. The prosecutor characterized the messages as a woman who was upset, getting more so with each call. To be fair, on the other side of things, journalist Elizabeth Cutter with the Gazette, who heard the tapes, reported that to her, Phyllis didn't sound angry, but more just sad. With the witnesses, because the state didn't need to prove that Phyllis was holding the knife, a lot of the case just focused on proving that it wasn't an accident like Phyllis said. They called the medical examiner to testify that a lot of force would have had to have been used for that little paring knife to go in far enough to do the damage it did. It was more than you could have gotten by someone just walking into it. On cross, however, the defense asked the ME what studies he was using to come to his conclusion that a small knife couldn't have gone that deep without force. And he really had none. He was testifying his own opinion that wasn't based on research. I think the strongest part of the prosecution case, however, was the 911 call where Phyllis was heard taking responsibility and saying that she did it and Richard was with his lover. This was made before she could really reflect on what happened and, in the state's view, come up with a story. What she didn't say immediately was that this was an accident. The defense worked hard to show a bigger picture of how this happened in the hopes it would prove that it was unintentional, and if not unintentional, it was self-defense when faced with the rage of an abusive husband. They had their own experts who testified that the stabbing did not show signs of being intentional. The first thing these experts did was contradict the ME on how much force would need to be applied. They also said that in most intentional stabbings, there will be more than one wound. There would also be defensive wounds to the hands and the forearms as the victim is trying to block the knife. Richard had no defensive wounds, which backs up Phyllis's version that he walked into the knife because he didn't see it. One of the experts also said that stabbings usually have evidence of a knife being twisted, as there is usually a struggle, and that was not present here. Basically, the single stab wound did not contradict Phyllis's story that Richard walked into the knife like the state argued it did. The defense then had longtime friends of Richard testify about how withdrawn and depressed he seemed, and they had both of Phyllis and Richard's daughters testify about similar personality changes. They backed up Phyllis's story about being afraid of him. They testified that things were rather idyllic in their childhood until the summer of 1999, when Richard started spending less and less time at home, and when he was home, he was irritable. That irritability eventually grew into an unpredictable temper. They talked about instances where Richard would blow up in anger, literally shaking in rage, and it was not a side of him they had ever seen. They testified to an incident where Richard was berating Phyllis to the point that they were both afraid for her safety, and they went into the room to intervene. Phyllis took the stand in her own defense, which is where we get the bulk of the story about what happened, and we've already gone over that, so we won't do that again. And she was also confronted with some things she said to the police, like the statement about how she was responsible because he was with his lover, and another statement where she had indicated that she did intend to hurt Richard. Phyllis said she meant that comment only in the context of what had happened. She didn't want to hurt Richard, and she didn't plan on it before she got there, but what she meant was that when she picked up the knife, she was willing to do what she had to protect herself. After closing statements, the judge took the case, but unlike a jury trial, the judge doesn't just sit around until he comes to a decision. Each side was allowed to file additional briefs in the case until a certain cutoff, which was 4 weeks after closing statements. Then each side had 10 days to respond to the other side's brief. And then the judge would come to a verdict when he was ready. The options here were not guilty, guilty of first-degree murder, or guilty of anything below that, meaning murder in the second degree, voluntary manslaughter, or involuntary manslaughter. Closing statements were in mid-January, briefs were due in mid-February, and the verdict didn't come in until mid-March 2003. And the judge found Phyllis Nelson guilty of voluntary manslaughter. He rejected both the state's theory and Phyllis's story, and found that Phyllis intended to stab her husband, didn't intend to kill him, and acted in, quote, sudden, violent, and irresistible passion. Phyllis, who had been free on bond, was then taken into custody. The judge had a range of sentencing options, but 5 years was the minimum because this crime had been committed with a dangerous weapon. At sentencing, Phyllis thanked the judge for being respectful towards her during the trial and said she grieved for Richard and the loss their children and grandchildren had suffered. Phyllis was then sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison, but would be eligible for parole even sooner than that. After the sentencing was over, Mary Jo gave a prepared statement to the media. In it, she said that contrary to how Phyllis portrayed Richard, she knew him to be a kind, warm, gentle, and thoughtful man who she never saw lose his temper. She said that he had a quick wit and a sense of humor, and that he didn't deserve Phyllis's temper over the months leading up to his death before Phyllis finally inflicted a violent punishment on him. Mary Jo said she respected the judge's decision, though she wished the sentence was longer. Phyllis's attorney responded to this statement with some harsh words, saying that Mary Jo sounded like a scorned, scarlet woman who had no standing to make a statement about Phyllis, given the dynamic. He also said he was surprised at Mary Jo's need for additional publicity. Phyllis did file her intent to appeal, but she did this because you only have so many days to appeal after trial, and she wanted to preserve her right to do so. But she wasn't sure she was going to move forward. In the end, she decided not to, due to the emotional and financial burden it would place on her and her family. And if I was her, I would have made the same decision, but for another reason. The sentence for voluntary manslaughter was a lot less than she could have gotten if she was convicted on either of the murder charges. I wouldn't gamble with a new trial where I could get life in prison rather than just 5 years. In the end, Phyllis served about 3.5 years. In July 2006, a 3-member parole board voted to release her early, and she was let out in early September. While there was some public outcry that she served so little time and not even the 5-year minimum, the parole board had a very good reason to allow this. With good behavior, Phyllis likely would have been released the following year anyway. A good behavior sentence reduction has less supervision than parole. With parole, they were able to order her into mental health treatment, that they wouldn't have been able to do in a year when she likely would have gotten out anyway. This seemed like the best option when you look at the bigger picture. By this point, Phyllis's daughters were both living in Illinois, so she was paroled to that state so that she would have family support as she transitioned back to a regular life. Or as regular of a life as you can have when you know your actions, accidental or not, led to the loss of life. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.